Welcome, first of all, to the Partition Lecture Series. This is the sixth session. We've had six speakers so far, and this is the sixth session. We had two speakers in the last session. It was more of a panel discussion, and we've had historians like yourself, political scientists, scholars in literary studies, and sociologists, and we plan to have many more. So, welcome to the series, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Yes, that's okay.
You've sent us a very short introduction, but um, I'll have more to say. First of all, I'll begin with a um, limerick. Do you call it uh,
Uh,
limerick or limerick?
Limerick. Limerick.
Limerick. Yeah. So, Lailpur शहर बड़ा गुलजार इत्थे हैगे at bazaar. This was a limerick I heard from my parents um, ever since I was a child. And thank you, Pippa Virdee, for introducing me to taking us back to Lailpur. In fact, when you sent us the pictures of the clock tower my parents remembered from their childhood, it came alive. And they never talked about Lailpur, they were very young. My mother was only 7 years old and my father was 14. But they never talked about Lailpur as such. When they saw the pictures, the photographs you had sent, they came
Yeah.
running. So thank you so much for taking us back to Lailpur, and it's kind of stirred up a kind of Pandora's box because we have a group of Lailpur, not just historians or Lailpurites who congregate online, and they've
Yeah.
been sharing memories of the mental maps of the city, how it looked like, and the city as it is, as we see in your books. So let me welcome and introduce Dr. Pippa Virdee, who's a reader at De Montfort University, Leicester, UK, where she teaches modern South Asian history. Her research interests include British colonial history, history of the Punjab, the South Asian diaspora in Britain, and women's history in modern Pakistan. Her books include From the Ashes of 1947, Reimagining Punjab. She's co edited Refugees and the End of Empire and Coming to Coventry, Stories from the South Asian Pioneers. Her recent articles include Women and Pakistan International Airlines in Ayub Khan's Pakistan, and From Manu Majra to Fakirawala, Revisiting the Train to Pakistan with Arafat Safdar. She's currently working on a very very short introduction to Pakistan. Now, I first came across her work when she shared it with us about her essay on her ethnographic work on the displacements which were brought on by partition, and how it was not random, but it was kind of arranged between families who migrated from Ludhiana to Lailpur and Ludhiana. She traced those connections in one of the essays. That was when she was still working on her PhD, I understand. But more recently, she's published her book, which I had the pleasure of reading, and I'd hope to review it sometime. From the Ashes of 1947, Reimagining Punjab, which revisits the partition of the British Indian province of Punjab, the attendant violence, and as a consequence, the divided and dislocated Punjabi lives. Navigating nostalgia and trauma, dreams and lemons, identity, identities and homelands, it explores the partition of the very idea of Punjabiyat. It was Punjab, along with Bengal, that was divided to create the new nations of India and Pakistan. In subsequent years, religious and linguistic subdivisions arguably, no other region of the subcontinent has had its linguistic, and ethnic histories submerged within respective national and religious identities. None paid the price of partition like the pluralistic pre-partition Punjab. And this book analyzes the dissonance, distortion, and dilution witnessed by Punjab and presents a detailed narrative of the past. With Dr. Pippa Virdee's work, we move beyond, we cannot ever leave the trauma of partition behind, but her books and her articles have moved to the aspects of partition which have not been engaged in partition studies. For instance, the trauma of displacement, because a lot of her work focuses on the trauma of displacement and resettlement. So, in the last few lectures, we've had eminent historians and scholars talk about the traumatic experience of partition violence. Now we move on to the next phase of displacement with her work. But today she's going to talk to us about the role of power and technology in the new age of partition historiography. With that, without further ado, I would request Dr. Virdee to begin her lecture. And thank you, Dr. Professor Nesbitt, for introducing us, because you remember it was you who introduced me to it, Pippa, on my first visit, and after that, there's been no stopping. Thank you so much. So, Professor Dr. Pippa.
Thank you, Anthony, so much for that introduction. And it's so nice to see Eleanor here as well. We've been conversing through email, so it's nice to see you here. Anjali, if I may ask, how long do I have?
You have 40 minutes. 40 minutes.
Okay.
And then we would have some time for Q&A.
Okay, good.
We'll have a discussion.
So what I wanted to, and thank you so much, firstly, for inviting me to this. I think it's a wonderful initiative. I've seen lots of things going on, through the kind of online things that I don't. I've just got an echo here for some reason. Let me see if I can maybe deal with that echo.
Maybe I should unmute myself. That echo might be, yeah. Let me unmute myself. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see if that helps. Yeah, it might be that actually. Yeah, I think yes. Thank you. That's fine. So thank you so much. Like I said, I think there's lots of different things which are going on through using technology and through this kind of online forums. But it's fantastic that you've been doing something on bringing together a host of lectures around partition. And what I've been doing actually over the summer is working on a few new ideas, which I have to say that you're the first audience I'm sharing this with. So I really welcome any comments, feedback, thoughts that you might have. And the area that I've been working on, and as you know, I've been working on partition for a long time now, but the area that I've been trying to develop is the ways in which, especially in the last 20 years, the kind of changes have taken place around partition studies, and particularly trying to kind of understand how a number of different threads have connected and converged together, and try to critique some of these things, particularly through, as I said, through this idea of the concept of using power and technology, because I think one thing that has certainly it certainly has come across to me, because I've been sort of doing this now for 20 odd years, and when I first started using oral histories, I think before you turn off your speaker because it's still echoing quite a lot.
Is it still echoing?
It's still echoing. I think because your speaker is still on, so
Ma'am,
I
you
think
need to
you're
mute
hearing.
yourself, Anjali ma'am.
I
Uh,
unmuted myself.
So you are unmuted right now.
Oh,
yeah. Oh, that's it. Yeah. That's fantastic. It's just I could keep hearing myself talk all the time. So the ways in which technology has really had a huge impact. So from when I started, I was using a cassette player to how now you can use a mobile phone to record these testimonies. So the speed with which we can gather this information and how quickly we can share it across different forums, I think that was one of the things that got me really kind of thinking in terms of the kind of huge changes that have taken place. And I wanted to try to kind of understand this in terms of partition and how we look at this. So I suppose at the same time, what's also happened, and this is kind of a simultaneous thing alongside with that kind of technology, is that there's been this huge surge in interest in partition, which to some extent has been moving on and expanding from just looking at purely from a kind of historical and a political aspect to also looking at it from a kind of social and an individual personal perspective. And I think what's been happening is then there's been this kind of blurring of boundaries between academic research, this public outpouring, social media, and in many ways in the kind of Western academia, the kind of need for impact in terms of how our research has an impact on wider audiences. So in a sense, this essay is really trying to kind of explore some of these developments and to try to actually muddy a kind of and present a non-linear history, which is enmeshed in this kind of world of basically trying to do self-projection in the name of social history. And I want to kind of share some of these ideas with you. And as I said, also welcome some of your thoughts. And at the heart of this, I would say, at the heart of this kind of change and surge of interest has been the use of oral history, which in a way kind of presents this authentic testimony, either by first, second, and now increasingly through the third generation of people who migrated. And in many ways, what you have is this impact on what it is about partition. And I would say that one of the things about partition that I'm particularly kind of interested also is in that what does partition mean for India and what does partition mean for Pakistan? Because I think they are quite different kinds of partitions. And then, of course, we had the added layer of the kind of complexity around the kind of Bengal partition, which is not just one but two or three if you count the 1905 as well. So you have these different meanings, different understandings of what we mean by partition and how of an impact it has in different parts and different regions of South Asia. And in this kind of surge and this interest, what has been happening is that technology has been used, and increasingly what I'm trying to also critique is this kind of form of crowdsourcing memories. And in fact, Tarunj Khanna, who himself was involved in the project, has written a piece about crowdsourcing memories himself. And I think it's kind of fascinating how we crowdsource this information, we use database, we use networks. And one of the things that is becoming clear is the parallels between this and Holocaust studies, and how, you know, they've been used, particularly with the diaspora leading this shift and change towards a kind of new understanding of partition. So what I wanted to do was kind of develop some of these ideas around oral history, around you know, the kind of technological changes, the diaspora, the links with Holocaust studies, and how actually what has happened in this kind of new historiography then is that actually what it's done is it's compressed, it's condensed, and it's flattened diversities in the name of kind of empowering and expanding our understanding of partition. I mean, I start with, I suppose, you know, in ways in which history, and essentially, of course, I'm a historian, in the ways in which, you know, history is really kind of expanded. So if we're looking from the kind of 1960s onwards, and the way in which oral history played such an important part in expanding what it is that we study from history, you know, delving into social history, for example, you know, this was key to oral history's development as well, of trying to give a voice to the voiceless. And so when I started my PhD research, that was my kind of aim, which was really about how do we document these voices which are so far, you know, hardly documented in the official sources, in the official documents. So starting with that kind of premise, really about kind of oral history and the relationship with partition, I think one of the developments you see is how, you know, people like Urvashi Batalia, Kamala Bisteen, Ritu Menon, you know, their work was groundbreaking in that, you know, we're looking at the other side of silence and borders and boundaries. It really, you know, really kind of changed how we look at partition, because it's no longer about the kind of high politics, it's no longer about just the kind of documents. This is about the very real human dimension and tragedy of partition, and particularly looking at it from a kind of female perspective, and you know, and subsequently looking at it from a kind of Dalit, or looking at Dalits, looking at children, these people who are hardly there in the official histories. So it was in a way, this is very much about the kind of allowing the subaltern to speak. And so the intermeshing of this kind of development within partition, overlaid with this expansion of social cultural history, I think it really kind of complemented each other. And of course, this is what I was picking up. So when I started doing my research, you know, this is what really kind of influenced me, this ability to, you know, have this huge, I suppose, impact and shift and change, the ability to empower those voices. So that played a very important part in my understanding of why I was trying to do this. But what I'm trying to argue then is that since then, there has been this huge explosion of interest in partition studies. And this is usually peaked at the kind of anniversaries, for example, you know, 2007, 2017, and I've been kind of, you know, involved in some of these things. And it's become almost this, you know, consumerist approach to consuming history. And I think within this, my kind of concern is that what voices are now being put forward, what is being represented in this popular history of partition, and this need to kind of document this very kind of, you know, real and human tragedy. And it's that which I'm trying to develop now. And one of the things that I, you know, one of the kind of points that I'm picking up is how this links in with the diaspora. So much of this change and this shift has been taking place from people based in or influenced, particularly, or I guess educated in the West, in the diaspora. So when more recently, some of you would have seen the kind of huge impact that Black Lives Matter has had, and how this is really been galvanizing people around the globe. And I think in the same way, what we're seeing in this diversification of trying to capture these different diverse histories is how we memorialize our past, and how, if I may use the word, monetize this past, and how and to what extent are we being selective about how we use and deploy this past. And there's this kind of fear which kind of grips me sometimes, that, what are we trying to represent? Who is it that we're trying to represent? And are the real sort of voices coming through, or is it some kind of filtered perspective which is coming through? And so this, need to kind of get on this kind of bandwagon as such, to make sure that, we have we represent ourselves, we talk about ourselves, and we talk about the pain and the trauma. I think what it does is, and I remember there's this, I was doing some research many years ago on Leicester, and someone used the term, we have to make sure that this isn't just a kind of a foods and festivals approach to multiculturalism, and there's that you can add other things to that kind of food and festival approach, but there is that kind of danger that we're not just kind of commodifying this, that we're actually really getting into the kind of the complexities of what they represent. And one of the kind of examples that I tap into are works such as Kavita Puri's Partition Voices, which initially started off, as collecting testimonies from the diaspora to commemorate 70 years, and has now been kind of turned into a kind of popular book. Another is actually Anju Malhotra's as well, her writing, which uses the kind of materiality and its celebrations of material culture to document, whilst on the one hand, this expands the kind of the study of partition, but on the other hand, trying to look at the kind of understand partition from the kind of material aspect, I found problematic in some ways, and I'll kind of allude to some of these issues in a short while. So there's been work like that. There's been many other things, which is all a lot of other work that has also kind of taken place, which I go into a bit more detail. But none of these kind of individual accounts, I suppose, have touched anything to the extent to what Harvard and Stanford universities have been doing. And they've been involved in these kind of huge, databases, gathering of oral histories, preserving and trying to, crowdsource these oral histories. Stanford University, which is associated with the 1947 Partition Archive, which is kind of created by Gunita Singh Balla, contains something like 9,000 videos based on, oral histories. And they're mostly conducted by citizen historians who've been given some basic training on collecting oral histories. And, this is funded through a crowdsourced platform. And interestingly, when you go to their landing page, it talks about give voice to untold stories, with the option to donate, and that donation box is quite prominent. So straight away you get this this flashing light coming on saying to kind of contribute, which is kind of fine. But then when you start to kind of look into what are the kind of accounts these are they collecting? For example, the landing page has 3 videos. 2 of those videos are in English. So one has to kind of interrogate this further in terms of, how and who are are these how are these voices being collected, how are these people being approached, who is doing the research, how are they being how are they interacting with each other. These are such important questions for us as oral historians, because there's so many kind of ethical issues involved in terms of how we approach people, how we document this kind of history. So I think for me, some of this is, has to be kind of critiqued, and I think it has been already to some extent, but and it is being developed further, and I hope to do so myself. So one of the things that you start to see then is how the diaspora has used the trope of the Holocaust, which actually, interestingly, Urvashi Batalia also, when she was doing her work on The Other Side of Silence, also used that of using the Holocaust as a kind of almost like a template. But you see this increasingly in the diaspora, and I suppose this is partly because of the kind of exposure that exists in the West to Holocaust studies and memory studies and how we use that. But I want to sort of look at this, that in terms of how we document these and preserve these memories. I think there's a very interesting quote, a powerful quote by Susan Sontag, who talks about, the pain of others. How do we record the pain of others? And I think this is where the kind of the ethics of this kind of work are very important, where, the Partition Archive, 1947 Partition Archive, one of the things that they are very clear about is that they are apolitical. But how do you document such a complex history and remain apolitical? And how do you, as citizen historians, understand the emotive and the huge complexity behind understanding the pain of others? Can we do justice to those stories through this kind of industrial approach? And that's something that I think I'm really trying to understand. So there has been this kind of development of partition, and it's and this kind of partition industry around testimony, memory, and handed down trauma, and how this kind of relates to, I suppose, also trying to understand how it relates to other genocides and other traumas and and other accounts. And I think one thing is for me is that you don't necessarily see that many other genocide studies using partition as a case study, but you certainly see it in partition studies where they've used the terms and the conceptualization of how we kind of understand these histories to, in fact, understand partition. So I think there is that, that it is one way rather than a two-way conversation between sort of genocide studies and partition studies on the whole. So I think, that's one aspect that, I'm very kind of keen to develop in terms of how we understand this kind of relationship between memory and Holocaust and Partition. And I'm just going to, I'm sorry, I'm just kind of also scanning my notes at the same time as reading. So I think what I, want to do then is I'll leave that part there in terms of the kind of the memory aspect, but what I want to do is look at two concepts, one of technology or the role of technology and how technology has had a huge impact, and then also then bring in the relationship to the concept of power. So the impact of new technology is transforming the ways in which we record, preserve, catalogue, interpret, share, and present oral histories. It has opened up a wide range of new possibilities and opportunities for sharing, listening, curating, whether these are audio or video in an archive, stored or streamed. Social media allows individuals or organizations to share stories instantly prioritizing the need to disseminate, but not necessarily to digest, dramatize, or not necessarily discriminate what is ultimately someone else's history or memory. Naturally, a number of scholars have cautioned against this kind of the pitfalls of this. They're multifaceted, from comprising the speed with which technology becomes outdated and obsolete to categorizing the ethical considerations of the click and share culture. Sheftel and Zembrowski have critiqued this exploitative nature of the digital world. It is, they argue, rooted in competitive private industry which thrives on selling us products and commodifying everything from how we communicate with our loved ones to how we read the news and absorb information and how we make decisions. This leads to a commodification of these accounts as the digital age and social media are dependent on and thrives on the constant supply of new over old. Big institutional archives can and do take this further by hiring advertisers for publicity, mining data, and selling personal information for advertising agencies. While the possibilities are luring, the modern practices of tech capitalism are critically contrary to the historically progressive ideals of oral history. More than ever before, we have vast amounts of data at our fingertips, more than we can possibly engage with in any meaningful way. The journey that oral history has taken from scarce and difficult recordings on cassettes to the vast digital dumps accessible online and has completely taken over the discipline by making conservation suitably conservative. While it has made it transnational and multidisciplinary, it has also rendered it rootless and context devoid, I would argue. Michael Frisch notes how the digital revolution has collapsed different forms of expression into a uniform system, thereby leaving no difference between text, photograph, drawings, models, music, speech, and visual information, which he argues can all be expressed as a digital information that can be organized, searched, extracted, and integrated with equal facility. Through this form, we lose individual substance to group stereotype, witness testimony to generational memory and relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee to market exchange mechanism. No longer a shared authorship of the narrative, it is now an institutionalized balance of power. So I think this is really kind of important in terms of how the relationship between technology and power exists, where, you know, when we look at oral histories being conducted, you know, it's a conversation. It's a conversation between two people. You pick up nuances. It's a complex kind of relationship. But what we do by this kind of industrial approach is we in effect, take that, I suppose we take the voice out of that and we control what is being said, because often what is happening is that, organizations like the 1947 Archive, for example, create content for us. And so the selection of the material is already done for us. They create stories that will appeal to the broadest, i.e. the majoritarian middle class base, among whom consumers will consume them and be emotionally touched, and I suppose enough for some to follow this on with donations. The content is then sort of calibrated to appeal to people who feel they are engaging with their history. Every visit is counted as a hit, providing a false sense of a wide-ranging popularity, with the added conceit that it is educating. Social media posts are cultivated to create interest, to like, to remember. And so this becomes part of this remembrance industry. And this is a term that I borrow from Ruth Linden, who used this in her work on the Holocaust. So the term curating has increasingly been expanded and used with respect to such setups. But what we really mean by curating is we're really editing. We rarely question the process and its executioners, because this is inevitable component of the plight of representation. So this kind of selection, rejection that gives the raw materials its varnish, the argument, as Frisch says, to some extent, even manipulation. And I think this is what I'm trying to say, that, we have to look at these in a much more critical way. And one of the problems is of the digital divide, which should compel us to reconsider those that remain outside the digital revolution, both as consumers, but also crucially as producers. There is an illusion that the digital world is democratic in its terms of accessibility. Instead, it is democratic in terms of being a market which rewards the haves over the have-nots. Much of the discussion on methodology draws on experiences and research in the West, but in South Asia, where my own research interest is located, there are, of course, sharp and deepening divisions. Whilst technology and accessibility of mobile phones has had a phenomenal impact in India, smartphones, data, access to power, electricity that is, all require a disposable income, which remains a luxury, especially across Central and Eastern parts of India and Western Pakistan. Literacy is taken for granted, both of those providing the testimonies, which is why I alluded to the fact that many of these interviews are conducted in English, for example. So again, Sheffield and Zabriskie have argued that the reluctance by many to share stories on the internet, or failure to provide adequate anonymity in the desire to open up access, ends up excluding the very voices we want to reach. I would take this further and argue that the desire for audio visual amplifies the voices of those who are able to express themselves through these mediums. Those uncomfortable will be edited out of the marketing. Close inspection of Partition accounts in most of the popular places shows that respondents are within the habitus of the privileged interviewer. So what I mean by that is, often you'll see that you're using your own networks to gather these stories, therefore amplifying the same kind of voices. So what might kind of appear as this kind of, huge democratizing project actually is not that straightforward. And I think for me, the kind of concern is about, those who are left out of this, as opposed to, those who are included. So then how does this kind of relationship between power and empowerment fit into this? Again, I start with Paul Thompson, who's this, the really the person who started articulating or the father of oral history. And he made a case for the transformative and empowering potential for oral history. And so for me, that was the thing that kind of really, pushed me to try to kind of use this, particularly when we're looking at Indigenous voices, people who are often left out of these spaces. And so there was this huge potential to reach out to these marginal spaces. And oral history was kind of compelling in them, in that. So the ambition of the 1947 Partition Archive then, has been to amass 10,000 plus testimonies, cutting across different languages, communities, and countries. They've been doing this now for a while with no research agenda other than collecting these accounts before they're lost completely. The archive perceives itself as apolitical in order to distance itself, ironically, from this very political process that led to partition and its aftermath. I think it is somewhat disingenuous that there is no active agency, an aloof privilege in making this assertion and not paying any price for it. More problematic is that by not engaging in the testimonies, we deny them their agency, we depoliticize their voices, and we leave them in a vacuum. The wider political and social milieu of partition is sidelined, while the human suffering has been foregrounded on a blank canvas in the name of a clean slate. Though it is important to document and understand this human tragedy, oral histories have a veneer of being rooted amongst the people, but in reality they're far more elitist and homogenous, and in this case are far from the Punjab and Bengal whose voices they seek to accumulate. The parallels would be to collect testimonies of the Holocaust and survivors, while at the same time being apolitical about the wider issues, either around Nazism or the Nakba. And Ravinder Kaur has argued about the deeply unsettling, depoliticized notion of human suffering, and more so when the memorialized past stands in isolation from the present. So history has to be this dynamic dialogue between the present and the past, not a dry recounting of what has happened in the past. And I think this is where the role of the historian, of course, is important, because you understand that kind of, or you at least try to contextualize that relationship between the past and the present. I mean, even if we talk about the violence in 1947, how can we understand the violence in isolation of what came before and what happened violence? Violence in South Asia has not disappeared since 1947. If anything, South Asia is even more of a violent society today. So I think that is the importance of giving it that contextual, political, a wider dimension to understanding these stories. So what these accounts, I think, do is that they reduce these narratives. And so I've been sort of, trying to really kind of critique some of this work. So, for example, I mentioned Puri's work, Malhotra's work, which is about the kind of 21 objects. But, my kind of concern about those objects was these are objects, and the respondents are mostly poets, landlords, intellectuals, lawyers, tax collectors, people of means. So, of course, the kind of material history of those objects tells us a particular kind of history, rather than a history that is not represented. It is a privileged history in many ways, even though it is a very kind of tragic history. I think one of the things that I find most problematic in some of these accounts is how the kind of, and this is the case mostly so far in Puri and Malhotra's work, is that there are accounts of British oral histories in a way by including them in their work, you try to kind of frame that equality, that human suffering is equal, whether you're the colonizer or whether you're the colonized. And I found this particularly disturbing, that how can we kind of, equalize this kind of suffering between these two very different accounts. And so the kind of inclusion of these stories, I think, for me, was at odds at what we were trying to kind of do. So just kind of bringing this together, I use Ruth Linden's work, and reflecting on our own research on the Holocaust and other oral history projects. I think what it does is it challenges us to think about Holocaust survivors and how they are being represented by oral historians, social scientists, and journalists. In short, people like me. Further, to what extent do survivors depend on a remembrance industry to represent them to the media and, she says, to the American public? The question of presentation is an important one, or the representation is an important one, in terms of being at the heart of this discussion, because it is concerned with questions of power and accessibility, and to what extent has the subaltern found a voice. Linden uses the term remembrance industry, which she acknowledges may shock or offend some. However, her concern is a legitimate one, which is that to what extent have survivors' memories, to what extent these memories and survivors have become commodities. She uses the term industry for the various grassroots projects, history projects, and libraries, memorials, etc. So in trying to highlight the inherently political nature of the work of remembering, documenting, and commemorating. And I think while the field of oral history is full of promise about the digital age, I think there is at the moment a relatively little critique of that promise. And I think it's kind of, for me, it's the kind of ironies. I'm kind of talking about this work, and of course I'm using technology to share these ideas with you on the other side of the world. But I think this is one of the kind of misnomers, really, that we can be sitting in different parts of the world and we can feel connected, but to what extent does that kind of connectedness then compress and reduce these stories into this kind of homogenized form, which I think actually is not the right way to go about the representation of these very diverse accounts and stories. So these are some of the kind of the things that I've been working on, and I think I will leave it at that. And I'll sort of open it out or hand it over to you, Anjali.
Thank you, Pippa, for raising questions which have been bothering many of us who've been working with oral histories and problematizing the methodologies, particularly the question of power and representation that you brought up. In fact, when I saw Anshul Malhotra's book, I was very delighted, but I thought, now my grandmother could not carry her mantika with her, because most people left with what they wore. They did not have time to collect material objects, or the kind of objects they brought were more functional objects, maybe the bartans, or clothes. So it seemed like a very elite kind of narrative to me. Also, the 47 Partition and 1947 histories, because there's also a kind of what gets represented. There's also kind of when people when you talk about technologies and power, when people are being recorded, there's also an element of presentation, how they present themselves. So how the survivors want to present themselves, and usually it's a more elite, more articulate survivors whose stories get recorded because the interviewers also exploit their own networks, whereas we don't hear the other stories. Now, many of the participants here are have been doing oral histories for Partition 1947 as well as for my project. So I'm sure every lot of them will have questions. Many of the participants are students of my course called Globalization and Culture. For them, this is a very new area because we just started the course last week. But I would like them to think that they are all experts in technologies because they are engineers. So I want them to think about how technologies emancipate or empower certain groups and force other groups to be out of that. You remember we talked about the local us, the global us and the local others. For those who are not connected, are their stories being recorded? I'll take up these questions in the 2 weeks later, but please do remember what we discussed today. So the session is now open for discussion. We have about 20 minutes. Please ask your questions. If you can type in your questions, I can read them aloud. Or if you raise your hands, I can invite people to ask their questions themselves. I'm sure a lot of the oral history interns or citizen historians would have questions. The first question is actually by Dr. Sohal. He would like to know the partition historiography of the Punjab revolves around the paradigm of power and property. How is new historiography bringing in the narrative of the property less and the downtrodden like the Dalits, tribals and marginal communities? Even those who are doing oral history through digital systems are doing it with persons of power and property. Bias is being enforced. How can historians move beyond this historical bias? This is the first question by Dr. Sohal.
So, Anjali, yes, I mean, I agree with Professor Sohal there that I think those biases are being reinforced, and as you say, Anjali yourself, that I think, whilst on the kind of surface, some of these accounts look very exciting and they are moving the work in a different direction, actually, the problem is they are very elitist. The kind of histories that they're telling are very elitist. And this runs completely contrary to where oral history started from. Oral history's roots are very much about trying to document those marginalized communities. So actually it's gone completely full circle in that sense. And how do we kind of move away from this? I actually don't have the answers. I think my concern is that I have to raise this issue and I have to say something because I've worked in this area for so long, and of course, I've documented and interviewed hundreds of people myself who were affected by partition. So what I see in terms of the changes that are happening around me, how do we bring in the voices of the Dalits, of the tribals, of the marginalized communities? I think, I suppose, I would say to your students is to keep this in mind, to think very carefully when they go and if they do any interviews or if they speak to anyone, to ask themselves, to be self-reflective about who are they asking, who are they speaking to, what is their background, what did their father do, in terms of employment, what class do these people belong to, what languages do they speak? These are critical questions to us understanding something about those individuals and the kind of social capital they then bring with them. And that, in a sense, is very important in understanding those histories and the way those histories and our past is told. So, when you said that, in terms of, a lot of people just bought very practical things, or you just bought the bare necessities. You didn't think about bringing precious objects. In fact, if anything, many people told me how they buried their gold and things like that, and they left it behind, thinking that they would come back for those valuables, right? So I think from the kind of, in terms of how do we move forward, I would say, well, let's encourage the students and let's push the students into asking these questions and getting them to think carefully about who they speak to and asking those who, what, why, when kind of questions that us historians normally do when they're doing any kind of research.
There's another question from Tuba Masood. I think,
She,
would
yeah,
like yeah, would like to know how's the oral history of the Indian subcontinent's partition different or similar to the oral history of a writer like Svetlana Alexievich, who documents the sufferings of the Soviet people using the same medium.
uh, I've not looked at this myself. I think this is not an area that I've explored, and so I wouldn't like to say in what ways is is this different or similar. I think if there's something that she would like to add from her understanding, I think that might be useful for me.
Okay, I hope you got an answer to that. Neil has a comment. Neil, do you have a question as well? Neil Shah, do you have a question as well? He says that you cannot really compare Holocaust and partition.
Well, I think that was, that was my point as well. That I think, and so one of the things that I go on to develop is that is the language and the terminology that we use to understand the Holocaust, is that appropriate for us to use for partition studies? Again, it's a question that I raise. I don't necessarily have the answers, but I think some of it is problematic, some of it might be useful. But this is where I was trying to kind of link the kind of impetus for this change coming through from the diaspora, because I think it's often in the diaspora that have had much more exposure to the Holocaust and sort of memorializing this on a kind of much bigger scale. Because of course in India and in Pakistan for that matter, something like this, other than the Partition Museum in Amritsar, it hasn't really been documented. And in my opinion, the Partition Museum is quite problematic as well. So in terms of, to what extent can we borrow from Holocaust studies? Well, I'm not sure we can. But it is a complicated, it's not a straightforward thing. And but these are important conversations to be had and discussions. I think that's the point, isn't it? That we have to understand these complex issues.
So I noticed that
In the German context, in the Holocaust, there is a clear villain and a clear hero, like as seen through the historical lens that Hitler is the villain and the Nazi Party was the villain. But in the case of partition, it's a bit of a mesh. Like it's just people and their uh, kind of natural reactions to what the conditions were prevalent then. So there is no clear villain there per se. I think that, I mean, how does that play a role in the documentation of and I mean the continuation of that perspective, or the story which is being framed here?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point in that actually, in terms of partition, there is no clear villain or victim as such, because sometimes the victim also becomes the perpetrator, right? So how do we document these kind of histories where, you know, the victim can also be the perpetrator and the other way around, and there's no clear boundary between the two. So this is why I think some of the ways in which we use Holocaust studies, they may not necessarily work for us in partition studies, and we need to kind of think about it in a different way, because of course, there've been some scholars who have used to frame this in terms of a genocide, um, which, yes, it works to some extent, and you can sort of see this, but of course we are doing this retrospectively as well, because the idea or the concept of the genocide comes about after this. So I think, yeah, there are questions that we have to ask ourselves, and I think Neil is right to ask that, there is no clear boundaries, and how do you then sort of capture that vagueness and that blurred line.
Hello, ma'am. This is Aishwarya.
Hello.
Hi, ma'am. So I'm working under Professor Roy, and I've been collecting, documenting stories of partition survivors from South India. And one thing that I've noticed is that while I talk to first generation survivors, they are reluctant to share their story. But when it comes to second generation survivors, they are more curious to know about their past, about their history, and they come forward and tell us their story. So if you could comment on that, that why is that the case?
So let me get this right. You're saying that the kind of first generation are they don't come forward; they have to be sought.
Yeah.
Whereas the second generation show more curiosity.
No more curiosity to know their past, to know their history.
Right. Well, I mean, firstly, I would say that, I think in terms of the first generation, this is a diminishing population. There's so few left now of that first generation. But obviously, there is this kind of curiosity between, subsequent generations to want to have a better understanding of their past. The generation that goes through it almost takes it for granted because it is a part of them. They take it for granted. But if you've not experienced that yourself or know that, then I think you might show more curiosity to know about your past. But I suppose our job is to then try to understand the differences between those generations and how they represent themselves and how they tell their accounts. How is a first generation recounting those events? How is a second generation then using those accounts to understand that past? And then also third generation as well. And this is where the kind of then the history becomes quite sort of muddy, and this is what I'm trying to do, is to kind of create this very kind of non-linear way, that it's not this kind of straightforward, let's go into 1947 and understand this history.
Yeah.
It's actually, it's a very complicated history. It's a very political history. It's a very complicated history. And there are no easy answers. And I think we have to recognize that it doesn't just, stop and start in August 1947. There is that long process that leads to it, and it's carried on into the post-colonial period, as we see it manifesting itself in many different ways around us, even today.
Yeah.
Thanks. I think we have a question by Charu, who's been collecting stories for the Partition Museum. Charu, would you like to ask your question yourself, or do you want me to read it out? Okay, I'll read out her question. I found that some of the privileged narrators I have recorded, trying to tell about their experience by usually in a way that this was something lower class people suffered. And later, while interviewing their family members, I found that these were actually stories from their own families, which they were not able to accept as their own, perhaps, or were ashamed to do so on camera. How do we ensure the reliability of these oral history narratives? This is what Chad wants to know.
We don't, and I think this is where I was saying that, I think when you're collecting stories like this, as a citizen historian, it's very difficult for you to unpick these things and contextualize them. But if this is being done by someone who is an oral historian, for example, has collected many accounts, will be able to kind of understand and contextualize this. I mean, this is something that I recognize straight away. I did this interview it was in Pakistan, and I was speaking to some women, and we were talking about rape and abduction at that time. And if I say it in Punjabi, Anjali, ਉਹ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਸੀਗੇ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਨਾ ਫਲਾਣੇ ਦੀ ਕੁੜੀ ਸੀਗੀ, ਉਹ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਗਵਾਂਢੀ ਸੀਗੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਕੋਲ ਸੀਗੇ. In a sense, what they're doing is they're shifting the relationship and saying कि वो उनके direct contacts नहीं थे, वो उसके और उसके यहाँ contacts थे, कि कोई जानते थे, किसी को जानते थे, in their village. So it's almost like what you're doing is you're removing that relationship and trying to distance, especially when it's something which is so sensitive. And so people do this, and they've done this. And it's not that, our job isn't to sort of question the kind of the truthful nature or at least the reliability. I think it's more to kind of understand why people do this, why people feel that they have to present this information in this way, why they can't just say, no, actually it was someone from our family. Why do they feel the need to distance themselves? So I think that's the thing, that's where the real kind of value of doing interviews is, that you can understand it from that kind of perspective. I see there's lots of comments at the bottom now.
Yes. Arun, would you like to ask a question? Do you want me to read it out? Arun Nair. Okay, I'll read it out. Is it visible how the ripples of partition are still at work? It's visible. How can these efforts taken by its historians help in calming and soothing the issues, given that people tend to get more polarized?
Well, I hope people like Arun are going to make efforts to calm and soothe, because I think it is that young generation, really, isn't it, that we hope are, less polarized. I think, again, it's very difficult to kind of separate the politics from what is happening, and so we are very much dependent on the new generation, on society around us, not to kind of fall into those kind of trappings. But unfortunately, society is very polarized, and that is the reality. I don't have a magic wand. If I could make it go away, I would make it go away. But I can only hope that your students are more critical and skeptical of some of the things around them.
This question continues, and each the milestones like a century, and all will get people talking more, and each have their own analysis of these oral histories. So he is bringing in the political. How can one hope to mitigate extremism by recording history appropriately?
Appropriate. Well, I mean, one of the things about history is that we say that it's important to kind of understand history, and we can learn from the past so as to not to repeat these things again. I mean, if I can give you a better understanding of the past, make you question what was happening at that time, what has been happening in the last 70 years in India and Pakistan, I would like to hope that, you, when you grow up, when you go into the place of work, or whatever you do, you don't do those same things again and again. I think the onus has to be on us as a society, rather than, saying that, how can historians do this? I think we all have to take collective responsibility to make the society around us a better place, and to mitigate extremism of any kind.
Exactly. We have a question from Prachi. Prachi wants to know, Prachi, should I read it out? How does the Partition Museum in Amritsar function in juxtaposition to the Jewish Museum Berlin? Is it equally problematic, considering the analogy between partition and Holocaust? This is what she wants to know.
So I've only been to the Partition Museum before it officially opened. And of course, I've kind of seen some of the kind of subsequent things. I think my kind of concern about the Partition Museum in Amritsar, and I think, Anjali, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't there an initiative to start something in Bengal as well?
There is.
Yeah. So the thing with the Amritsar one is that I think the thing is it presents itself as a people's museum, but it's not a people's museum. It's a private initiative. It's in the old town hall, a colonial town hall in Amritsar. It's a beautifully renovated building, I have to say, but it is a private initiative. But I think it presents itself as a people's history. But the kind of the things and the objects that were placed back then, again, for me, it's about, well, how representative is it? To me, some of the things were particularly nationalistic. So again, if we're trying to kind of, be a bit more representative, how do we move away from a biased kind of history? How do we move away from a more representative history, one which isn't just, your usual sort of voices coming through? And I suppose, I mean, India doesn't do museums particularly well. There's very few good museums, and something like this is a particularly difficult thing to have in a museum. So I think, it would be interesting, for example, if say we did something with your students, even to say, if there was a museum of this kind, what would they like to see in that museum? What are the sort of things that they would like represented in that museum? Because I think that would be quite interesting for me, and might be quite illuminating as to, some of these kind of questions that we've been asking. I don't want to kind of make the analogy between the museum in Berlin and the partition. That isn't kind of fair for me to do that at this point.
We have two more questions, two final questions. One is which brings in the diaspora. In the diasporic community, do we find a difference in the narratives of the first generation survivors and that of those of the second and third generations? Do we find a degree of romanticization?
Yeah, I mean, part of it, you could say, is a romanticization, but I suppose a part of it is also about, I think there was that former kind of question also, about the different generations and how different generations remember this. That the generation that experienced it would, not necessarily remember it in the way that second, third generation want to, recall that history or hang on to that kind of history. Because I think for them, they're kind of removed from the kind of direct association. So by kind of going and sort of uncovering their histories, it's a way of connecting to their past. I think rather than kind of romanticization, I think it's more about the sense of identity and wanting to kind of identify with their past and trying to kind of understand that. So one of the things that I was trying to do was really sort of complicate it further by how this kind of diverse histories fit in with this kind of Black Lives Matter, because I think part of what we're doing is also this trying to kind of reach out into our past, so that it's represented in the diaspora.
The final question is, now we have more questions coming. Short. It's Tripathi has a question. What similarities do you find between partition violence and that of Holocaust, particularly from the perspective of the survivors? And then Varun has a question. Varun wants to know, the partition era was chaotic, fueled by the hate between Muslims and Hindus. How can we attain a neutral perspective of the history when both communities tend to focus on their own losses and the real cause of the chaos and social tension cannot be specifically pointed out?
Well, I suppose both of those are linked, aren't they, in terms of thinking about the violence. I mean, there's been a lot of very good work on trying to understand the partition violence in different, both in Punjab, in Bengal, but also remember that, there were other parts of India. Bihar, for example, hardly gets mentioned, but Bihar experienced a lot of violence as well. So how do we try to kind of understand and get a neutral perspective? Well, I think more than a kind of neutral perspective, I think again as students, you should be asking yourself these questions and trying to, at least kind of gather the different perspectives. What are the different, perspectives in this? In terms of the kind of victims, the perpetrators, and that was one of the things that I was trying to do in my book, which was, a comparison of East and West Punjab, is actually when you look at the violence, there was a lot of similarities, whether it was a Muslim or whether it was a Hindu or a Sikh, there were similarities in the kind of violence being meted out, and then also in terms of, the impact this had on those individual lives. So one thing would certainly be that, when you do your research, you don't try to just get one perspective. You may not necessarily agree with the other perspective, but try to at least explore some of those alternative and other voices to get a more rounded understanding of what happened. I think that's very important for you as students. To keep asking questions. I think that's one thing I always say to my students is you have to ask questions and to be critical of these things.
I think you've been fortunate because you've been able to interview people on both sides and get perspectives from both sides. And it seems to me that the stories kind of mirror one another. So you cannot really blame one side for what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And you do acquire a neutral perspective when you see that each story repeats itself. Varun, maybe that's your answer. Yeah, Varun, yes, understood. Thank you very much, Pippa, for this. Each time we come up with a surprise, we think you're going to repeat something from your earlier work, but you have something new. And this is something which many of the participants today would identify with because they are grappling with these questions. Many of them are doing oral histories and I'm sure this has been a great learning experience for them. Personally, for me, I've been thinking about these questions all along, and I'm so happy that you voiced them because I've been like kind of silently asking these questions or posing them once in a way to say that look, everybody did not come back with, everybody, people did not even have cameras. So, in those
Mm,
days, very few families possess photographs. So, how do you reconstruct a history through photographs? Only the elite had photographs,
mm.
everyone didn't have cameras. So, those kind of questions and the relationship between technology and power is particularly fascinating.
I would say, Anjali, I mean, I hope that, your students, I suppose, I wanted to talk about these issues because being at an IIT, I think is very important that you raise these questions yourselves. I think they're things that we're grappling with all the time, and I would like to think that your students will now go on and think about them in a much more constructive way because there's such important issues. It has such a bearing on our contemporary society that I think we have to be critical. We have to ask questions. If there's one thing I would sort of say again and again, to students, particularly the audience here, please be critical. Please be, please ask questions. You have to question everything. That is the only way you can start to kind of uncover some of these and unpack some of these issues. Um, and, it's great to do oral histories. I think that, the kind of stuff that's going on, some of it is fantastic. But we have to, at the same time, be also mindful and critical of what is around us. So yeah, I mean, it's been lovely, interacting with you and your students, Anjali. Thank you so much.
We'd like to thank you once again
Thank you so
on
much.
behalf of Partition Lecture Series and on behalf of all the students, I thank you.